Welcome back to the Liberating Generations podcast. I'm Dr. Keesha Ewers, and this is my daughter, Regan Claire. In this episode, we're going to explore the relationship between generational and personal trauma and overwhelm, fear, and that big word that we all hear and experience ourselves, self-sabotage.
Joe Rignola is an entrepreneur, filmmaker, and best-selling author. He began his own health journey about 15 years ago while dealing with depression, severe digestive issues, weight gain, and blood sugar dysregulation. Joe recently started Well Connected TV, a new digital wellness company whose primary focus is supporting humanity to live their best lives, embrace their highest health, and to recover and discover how to be well connected. Joe, it's so great to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so grateful for the opportunity. Thanks for having me.
I was commenting before we went live that I always have had, I don't know, how long have we been connected? I think about 12 years, 14.
Probably somewhere in that neighborhood. At least,
Yeah.
8 years, 9 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's always been with you on the other side of the camera. In the background, making sure everything goes well, the creative genius. And I am so delighted to be able to bring you on this side of the camera. And of
Um,
course, we're starting out with talking about intergenerational trauma, and I would love to really invite you to talk about anything that comes up for yourself personally as far as your story of generational trauma and how that's impacted this big word self-sabotage.
Mm.
well, I'm grateful we're starting out with such a light topic for for the interview here. No, I do. Again, I really appreciate the opportunity. It is definitely a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I'm grateful for that. Um, I wasn't necessarily aware of the concept of intergenerational trauma until somewhat recently, probably within the past few years. But it really hit home for me. My wife is a really gifted energy worker, shamanic practitioner, and I was doing a session with her. I believe it was a cord cutting ceremony, and my great great grandfather came through in that session, basically apologized for this lineage of anger and fear that you know plagued me for most of my life, and then couple that with my own experiences just in this lifetime, all those wonderful layers, um, are complex, and that was my first personal experience with intergenerational trauma, and it was overwhelming but liberating, and to clear that energy to a certain extent, um, was really profound, super profound.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about cord cutting, that's something I do in my practice a
Mhm.
lot with people. And just to describe it, right? When we're cord cutting, we're cutting those spiritual, psychological, emotional, karmic ties to that which doesn't serve us any longer, that which we've been hooked into. You could think of it as like an umbilical cord. And oftentimes it's generating some sort of vampiric energy. You could say like a draining instead of a nurturing, right? If you want to cut any of those kinds of cords, they're there. And this idea that like your great grandfather coming in, I've had that experience too, where my grandfather came in, who I never met. He had rheumatoid arthritis, and he's
Mhm.
the one I talk about all the time
Right.
about, the genetics that I got with RA. And he came through when I was very first learning energy work and apologized to me and asked me to pass it on to his son, my father, for not being the father that he was meant to be. And what he said is, I will always watch over Cameron, who's my oldest son, when he learns to drive. He will be safe. And it was very fascinating because my son at that time, I think, was 8, like I hadn't even thought about driving. Yeah, and then when he uh was coming up to that point where it was time to drive, I don't know if you remember this. He had so much anxiety that when like when you're the parent and your child's learning how to drive, when I would get back in the car, in the driver's seat, the steering wheel would be soaking wet. Like he had so much anxiety. And he'd been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome shortly after that visitation from my grandfather, and just like a lot of, real intense anxiety with driving. And I thought, wow, that's so fascinating that all those years ago, 8 years ago, he actually said, this is where I will show up. So I don't know. What are your thoughts about as we cut those cords, like, it seemed like he was doing a karmic payback in a sense.
Yeah, what stood out to me is that not all of the cords get cut. There
Mhm.
are some chords that are lessons that we need to maybe remind ourselves of, and so you don't cut all of the chords. You cut
Mhm.
the ones, at least this was my experience, cutting the ones that didn't serve us or were
Yeah.
blocking us. But there are certain ones that, maybe they're not comfortable, but they're reminders and sort of guideposts to the lessons we learned from that. So that was an interesting experience. I'm curious, I want to ask you, did you tell your son about that experience with your grandfather, and did it make him feel safer?
I think at the time it didn't mean a lot. And then I'm not sure if it made him feel safer or not, but it actually made my grandpa, uh, it, it brought some peace to him.
Yeah.
I guess his dad had a major anger issue, and we actually have a lineage of real anger in our male line that has been brought to my attention again in the last year. That's a real. I don't know if you're familiar with like Stephen Kessler's 5 personality and energy patterns, but it's a lot of fire, and it can really get out of control in some of the males in our lineage. And so that seemed to be him kind of saying the same thing, like, I I'm sorry about this, right? Let's try and heal
Yeah.
it, and so I think that's pretty. I think it was less about the driving and more about the pointing to that particular lineage issue.
It's the thing that's been really fascinating for me is when we do this work today in our lifetime, in this present moment, how it heals generations before and after.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is what this
Mind
podcast is
blowing.
all about. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
like, if you hadn't been doing the work that you're doing, and same with me, if I hadn't been doing the work that I'm doing, I wouldn't have gotten that visitation. I wouldn't have gotten that opportunity to heal that bond. My grandfather of all people, who I've obviously never met, and now I get to sort of pass that uh, um, more healing energy to my kids
Yeah.
and their kids, and it's all really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my dad, he'd been trying to get a hold of my dad, and my dad hadn't been open and receptive, right? So he tagged into the one that, and in our family, there's a lineage of female healer. They are called Fae, Fey, in that Celtic healer way. And there's a long lineage of women. And so it's like this balancing inside of our tree.
Yeah,
So one is meant to balance the other, I guess.
that makes sense. That makes
hmm
sense. Really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually the Fae lineage that runs in our family. That's kind of how this podcast really was inspired. I'm in recovery right now from an alcohol addiction. I'm 5.5 months, and
Oh, congratulations.
thank you, thank you. And when I was in the thick of using it to cope with anxiety, my mom actually brought that to me. She was like, we are lineage holders. And, my grandmother had come to her, and our, like, that source team came to her and said that. And it really resonated with me. Of course, back then I was upset. I was angry. I'm like, I didn't want to hear it. But since, since getting sober, that's really resonated. It's like, wow, every time I was abandoning myself essentially. I
Mhm.
was doing a disservice to our lineage. And, I don't have kids yet, but I think there'll be some in the future. And if I didn't do this work now, if I didn't cut those cords, if you will,
Mm,
to that background of addiction that runs through our family tree, I would just pass that on to my kids.
of course,
So
of course, and it's
that's
almost like you had to experience that to
Mhm.
some degree in order to understand it, so you knew you didn't wanna pass that through, and again,
Absolutely.
that healing goes both ways. So good, so good.
Absolutely. Yeah, Joe. So we're talking about self-sabotage. And before we started recording, you talked about how you could do a 3-hour segment on your own self-sabotage tendencies. So can
Yeah.
you can you talk more about that? How you think your trauma becomes self-sabotage?
Yeah, I mean, I've got plenty of experience with self-sabotage. So I think, for me, what has happened when we have these experiences in childhood, and again, like, you think about intergenerational trauma,
Mhm.
that alone can seem overwhelming because where does that end? Like, it seems infinite. And then you add, karmic debt and past life experiences, and then all the stuff that happens in this life. It all seems extremely overwhelming. And that's how it felt for me. Um, until you realize, well, you can't uncover it all. And there's some ease to that because maybe we don't need to. And it's just some awareness. But for me, when we have these experiences that get embedded in the subconscious mind, it's like we become this walking, talking amygdala. Refer to myself like that quite often, this walking, talking amygdala, because our brains become hardwired for safety. And that's all that matters is safety.
Let's
So self
define amygdala before you go on, Joe, for any
so so
viewers
the
who don't know what you're saying.
so the amygdala is this lower part of the brain. It's kind of this almond shaped effect. Amygdala means almond, but it's the part of you that there's no real language to it, but it's where it's sort of like memories, but it's not memories like pictures and sounds like the higher part of our brain experiences. It's emotional memories. Um, so when you feel anxious or fearful and you don't really know that what the reason for that is, it's the amygdala, maybe trying to keep us safe.
Mhm.
And so a lot of people just walk through life and their amygdala is dominant and because they're always fearful, they're always anxious. And that was me for greater part of my life. And still, still things that I struggle with. So, but we can interrupt the pattern of the amygdala by engaging it with our thoughts and awareness. So the amygdala is concerned mainly with keeping us safe. And it's an evolutionary sort of aspect to our brains where if we had to run from a saber-toothed tiger or hunt for food, that came in handy. The problem is when we have these subtle sort of underlying stressors or anxieties that part of the brain actually starts to grow and become more active, and the prefrontal cortex part of our brain can kind of atrophy. And so when you have these childhood events, and it's sort of surreal for me to talk to you about this because so much of what I've learned from you. So
I
this
love
is
that.
really kind of cool.
You and me both, Joe. You and me both.
But yeah, so the concept of small T trauma and big T trauma, I've got a lot of small T trauma, and there's this incredibly complex gradient. So you have these events in childhood, and then couple that with everything else that we've talked about, intergenerational trauma and all that, and then the stories that I was told growing up, to play it safe, don't take chances, get a safe job.
Mhm.
Um, you know, uh, it's really like this perfect storm of self-sabotage because there's things that I want to do. I want to serve this community. I want to help people with some of the things that I've struggled with. But it certainly isn't as safe as going to get a job as, a school teacher or, you know, something with benefits and a 401k and all of that. So we're taught, not to take those chances. And then certain events, maybe cause us to feel like, who am I to speak about this?
Mhm.
Um, why bother if I know if this is going to be like, maybe it'll be successful and maybe it won't be, or maybe it's going to completely fail. And so there's a sort of you get in this loop of, why bother? And it's funny, like even leading up to this interview, again, it's like, it's kind of this cool, surreal moment for me to speak about this. And it went really easy for me to be like, no, I'm too busy. I can't do it. And then miss this amazingly beautiful opportunity to have this conversation. So for me, trauma and self-sabotage really go hand in hand. And it's not until you sort of bring your awareness to it that you can start to liberate yourself from that. And it's a battle sometimes,
Mm.
and that's okay. I think just taking steps moving forward,
Yeah.
like taking action today, or the master class that we're doing, like that was a bit of a battle to ask for the interviews, the amazing community of people that we had to interview for the experts. Feel like I'm asking for help or I'm asking for something, right? And that's a whole that asking for help is shameful. I grew up believing that asking for help was shameful. And so, if if I if I don't ask for help, well, that's a form of self-sabotage because I can't do it by myself.
None of us
And
can.
so it's complicated. And I don't know that, at least for me, um, it's not something that has ever really gone away. The big difference for me was the awareness that this was happening because of past experiences and that I was safe. Just reminding myself that, okay, I'm sitting in my office, I'm warm, I've got food, I've got shelter, I've got great relationships, I'm safe. Asking someone to do an interview is not really that scary. And even if it is, like, no, I can do it anyway because I know I'm safe. And so I think to me, like that, if there's a takeaway for folks, it's reminding yourself you're safe, doing something that feels hard, and that's when the brain really starts to rewire itself
Well,
for
it's
the better.
also the amygdala is that child had part of us from the time we're born until we're about 26 years old. It's the
Mhm.
one that's mostly on deck because the
Yeah,
prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until
or
that
when
point.
you're 50.
Yeah.
Like in my case, it was like in my 40s, it was
Yeah.
still there. Dude,
Well,
still
it's
there.
it's going to still be there no matter what because it's the one that says, like, "That's dangerous, let's not do that." And
Yeah.
so it's asking the question, like you just said, "I'm in my office, I've got food, I've got water, I've got shelter, I've got relationships that are supportive, I've got everything I need." So then how old is the one that's saying it's not okay to ask for help?
Mhm.
And that's when, I love having people ask that question, how old is that voice? And then instead of saying, you're fine, right? Going and asking that little one, oh, you're anxious, aren't you? And saying, I get that. Back in that time period, that would have been not okay
Mhm.
because we were taught not to ask for help. But guess what? I've got this now
Mhm.
and I'm here and asking for help is a form of vulnerability, authenticity, and power
Mhm.
Yeah.
because then I get to work in community with other people.
Mhm.
We have this sort of bootstrapping mentality that comes from our culture too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Individualism, you do it on your own, you make it, and gosh, it's so isolating and disempowering,
Yes.
right? And Reagan's been really, really aware of that, acutely aware, right?
Oh, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. When I first asked her, "Do you think you have a problem with alcohol?" She burst into tears and said, "Yes." And then I said, "Well, how about if we get you connected to a program?" And said, "No, I think I can do it on my own."
Absolutely. Yeah,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
I tried to do it on my own, um,
Didn't want to
failed.
ask for help.
Did not wanna ask for help, didn't want to admit to, the outside world that I knew I had a problem. I wanted to just still give off the image of having it all together, whatever
Mhm.
that means, right?
Yes.
Having this image of being perfect
Mhm.
and oh man, that is just like self-sabotage in a nutshell. You're gonna fail when that is your objective is to be perfect. And I did.
I did.
And when I relapsed, it wasn't a very long relapse, granted, but when I relapsed and I finally did ask for help. And I finally did seek community, a sober support, started, going to meetings. That's when my life truly changed. It was like finding the support of being around people who were just like me, who understand what I'm going through. It makes you understand that you're not so alone. I made me understand I wasn't so alone. Uh,
Huge.
so much beauty comes from that, comes from that vulnerability of being able to say, look, I need help. And the blessings that have come in just since that's happened, exponential.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in this 5.5 months that she's been sober, I've attended some AA meetings with her in 12-step program. And I'm just like, why do you have to be alcoholic to get this every day? It's just like,
Oh, that's interesting.
people that are showing up and telling their stories, being so authentic, taking responsibility,
Yeah.
which is huge, taking responsibility. And then being able to ping off of each other and say, oh yeah, now in a 12-step program, I've heard so many people say, yeah, when I first discovered that I was an addict, I decided I would try and do it by myself. And then all of them says every addict ever until that I can do it by myself.
Yeah.
And not ask for help and not receive help and then not pay it forward, and they encourage you to pay it forward once you do have your sober legs underneath you. And, so you're in the grid and the energetic field in such a embodied way. Yeah.
That isolation that comes with not asking for help, which whether it's seeking help because you're an alcoholic, whether it's you have a problem with food, whether it's you really need help with a project you're working on. But keeping yourself isolated keeps you warped in that like mental cycle that
No one understands me.
no one understands me.
Are you doing that to yourself?
Exactly. No one understands me. I'm different. I'm alone. Oh God, I'm doing it all wrong. Imposter syndrome sets in.
Oh God.
It's
We all know about that one, don't we, Joe?
the shame
Every day.
spiraling starts happening. Yeah.
Every day. Every day. It's the imposter syndrome is strong.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, just what steps can you take? What
Mhm.
small steps? There's this concept of you've got to take massive action. It's like, well, not really. Like, well, or define what massive action means. For massive action for me, maybe sending an email to someone asking for help or asking for an interview. Because that one small step is going to help rewire my brain a little bit. It's going to help me feel freer and, in community with.
I'd like to make an agreement right here in public that I'm always here if you're supporting me, if you ever need anything. And it's
Definitely take you up on it.
and it's an honor and a blessing. It's not a burden, right? And that's the way most people feel about. Yeah.
Oh my God, yeah. That's what I grew up learning. It's like that burden, like asking. And it was also modeled for me. And I've got an amazing relationship with my dad, who's 89. Recovered from COVID twice and heart attack, and still playing the saxophone. It's incredible. But they built houses. They were in construction when I was a kid. They still are. But when I worked for them, it'd be like, how he explained or how he tried to explain things to me was by doing it for me. Right. And so what I learned was just, do it yourself. Want anything done right, you got to do it yourself, like that mentality. And I'm 53, 52, and I'm still like, that's still me. Like, I got to do everything myself. And it's funny because it wasn't until this project that I'm working on now when I really reached out for help with, with affiliate management and website design and copywriting and all that stuff. It's one of the first things I've done on my own, well, with Dr. Rob. But where I've really started to deploy help, and it feels amazing. Couldn't have done it on my own.
Talk about your project that you're working on right now. So cool.
Yeah. So it's called the Rewire Your Brain Masterclass. And my partner, Dr. Rob Downey, on the project. he's a functional medicine doctor. And for him, he sees in his practice the rates of anxiety and depression and stress skyrocketing. And for me, with my history of depression and anxiety, which, had started to creep in again over the past couple of years, realizing that, the world really needs this help. And so we reached out to a number of experts, doctors, psychologists, researchers in this field of brain health and psychology and, trauma. And everyone we asked said yes, which was really cool because we had kind of a short list of people that we really wanted to talk about. And everyone said yes, I think because we really put our hearts on our sleeves. And even during the interviews that I did, I was really honest with my struggles and my experiences. And I think that's what makes this a little bit different. It's because I'm really just one of the viewers here on the project, right? So I'm asking questions from the perspective of the viewer because I'm getting help as I'm doing these interviews. It's like they're helping me as helping the greater audience, and so it's been a really cool experience. And I knew how important.
Untold secret, by the way, of doing these projects is how much you get to learn on that side of the microphone.
It's almost it's self-serving.
Yeah.
It's selfish in a way.
I love it.
Well, in the most beautiful, amazing way, because we're not alone.
Mm-hmm.
So many people are struggling with this. And, I knew that just like, you hear, you've got to put the oxygen mask on yourself first in order to help the people around you. And I thought, well, what if I just take people along for the ride as I'm putting the oxygen mask on myself and asking these incredible people for help, essentially, so it's been a really cool experience. And I think by being vulnerable and transparent in that way, we've been able to pull stuff out of these wonderful experts that maybe they haven't had a chance to talk about before. So there's some really unique content in this and a really cool experience.
So one of the things Regan and I love is, we're now going to tap you for the same thing. Is learning what are your favorite practices? We talk about intergenerational trauma. We talk about liberation, but there's pathway in between their practices. People can't just do this on a cerebral level, right? It's not something you think your way out of. So what are some of the practices that have been illuminated in this project that you and Dr. Rob have been doing that you want to share with our audience?
To me,
we're taking notes over here.
So for me, it's I can talk about meditation and mindfulness, and I think all that's super important. Has been incredibly helpful, particularly for me, like being out in nature and combining mindfulness with like walking meditation, breathing exercises, breath work, plant medicine ceremonies. All of those things are incredible tools. But I feel like they open the door, and you still have to walk through it and walk up flights and flights and flights of stairs. And that's taking action.
Yeah.
And if you really want to, it's sort of like when you go through a plant medicine ceremony, it's profound and beautiful, and you have to integrate. Integration isn't just like the next morning talking about it. Integration is everything else.
Yeah.
So it's like the breath work, the talk therapy, that's like 1% of it. And then 99% of it is everything else in your life. And so to me, it's like taking those small steps, being able to, check those things off your to-do list every day, no matter how small they are, acknowledging yourself for taking those steps, allowing yourself to feel that little dopamine hit for checking that thing off the list. And that's when those things really, those actions become habits. And that's really when the magic happens. That's when the new neural connections happen in your brain. And it's a lifelong process. And when you realize that, you can't, you're never going to uncover all of it, right? We talked about intergenerational trauma and past life experiences and all that. So it could be overwhelming, or it could be liberating, because you realize you don't need to know all of it. You just need to be aware that something happened causing you to think a certain way, or self-sabotage. And then if you can take action in the face of that fear, I think that's when the magic happens. And it's every day. It's every day you wake up and do something that's going to move you forward, that's going to serve the community, but more importantly, serve yourself so you can continue to serve the community.
That right there is so important. You have to fill up your own cup before you can start giving back to the community.
Well, that's the 12th step. Like, you've got to go out and help someone,
Yeah.
right?
You have to
And
go
if
out and help someone. Yeah.
yeah, I've seen research that if you do 11 out of the 12 steps, but not do people relapse if they don't do that.
Absolutely. And there are 11 steps that come before the 12th step
Right.
reason. It's like
Exactly.
you are doing all of this work
Mhm.
to free yourself from these things that have held you back, and taking accountability, forgiveness practices. All of these things take place before you're ready to go out and help the community.
Yeah.
I think that, to another point to what the beautiful things that you've been saying, is also staying consistent with those practices.
Mhm.
Oh gosh, I know it can become so easy to become complacent, to allow the lazy mind, is what we like to call it, to take over. The lazy mind being the voice that says, I don't want to do it. I don't have enough time. I'll do it in a few hours.
Yeah.
It's like the excuse voice.
Or I'm going to go help all these other people.
Uh-huh.
Or I'm going to stay super busy in my workaholic ways. Or
Right.
lazy mind comes in both directions,
Both
right?
directions,
It's a Tibetan Buddhist term, lazy mind. It's not a judgment. It's a pointing to the ways that we keep ourselves occupied, whether it's sitting watching Netflix or being super, super over scheduled, right? Yeah.
These actions you take, allow them to become rituals. Like, think of them as rituals because it's your process of healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like Joseph Campbell had said something about rituals, and how it's sort of like, I think he said something about it being like your conscious being reminded, minded,
Mm-hmm.
wisdom that you're of this innate wisdom that we all have.
Mm-hmm.
The more actions you take towards, serving, towards bettering yourself. Bettering is probably not the right word.
Well, it's just
The more you
viewing yourself
through.
as the vast, limitless consciousness and awareness that you are. One of my teachers said, the methodology that I use in plant medicine ceremonies, she taught me, is that she calls it remembering that we cut off a member of ourselves, right? Maybe a part of our soul, part of our innocence, whatever it is, and that you're bringing that back together into wholeness, remembering. And it's that light is already there.
Right.
And, I always say, like, the mystery isn't outside of you. It's what you've been hiding from yourself the whole time.
Exactly.
Right.
And
so
that's the
you have to go
process.
seek, it's right
The
there.
process of uncovering that every day.
Yes. Yes.
Especially when you become aware of it, then it becomes a little bit easier because you realize you are connected to all of it, and that innate wisdom is in there. And it's like, when you have that thought of imposter syndrome, who am I? Like, who am I to come here and talk to Keesha Ewers about this stuff when I've learned so much? It's like, well, who am I not to?
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I have, it's almost like an obligation at this point.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, the way that I'll talk about it in circles is like, oops, sorry. Is how dare you keep your light from all of us, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. No, I think we're good. Well, we'll just tell them. All right. So this has something to do with the gut microbiome too. I want to bring this because sometimes people will think, oh, we're talking about spirituality, or we're, when we talk about past lives or intergenerational karmic cords that we started with, or emotional trauma, mental belief systems. And we have this way of separating and segmenting in our minds, organizing that, it's like, oh, well, how does this impact our genetic expression, the microbiome, our immune system, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned it when you talked to Dr. Rob for your interview for the Rewire Masterclass, we're more microbes than we are human, and they're really running the show. And it's this weird thing. It's like, where does the microbiome end and we begin? And this is blurry line. And then you can extrapolate that into like ultimately the universe, right? Like, where do we end and the ground begin, and then the plants begin and the universe begins. Like, it's all connected. And so, in more like physiological terms, when we're stressed out, it has an impact on our microbiome and our gut health and our intestinal permeability and all of that. So one of the things that I try to practice myself that helps, just with digestion, ultimately with microbiome signaling to the brain and all that stuff, is just a mindfulness practice around food. As you sit down to eat, hopefully, particularly if you prepared the food, think about the process of getting that food to your table, to your plate. Where did it come from? Who harvested it? Who planted the seeds? What sort of energy went into growing the plant or the animal, or, that level of mindfulness is going to put you into a parasympathetic state, which is going to help you digest the food more, which is going to help feed your microbiome in a healthy way. The microbiome is going to, for every signal that the brain sends down to the gut, there are 7 to 9 signals that are sent up to the brain through metabolites of the microbiome. And so it's this beautiful synergistic relationship, and it's unavoidable. So if we can keep our microbiome healthy, it's going to keep our brain healthier. It's going to keep our mood elevated. It's going to reduce stress and anxiety. And if we can reduce stress and anxiety through different practices, it's going to have an impact on our gut health and our microbiome and inflammation and all that. And so, we can spiral downward, or we can spiral upward. And I'm always fascinated with that for that one signal for every 7, one signal we can control. We can control that. We can interrupt the pattern by changing our thoughts, changing our practices.
Mhm.
So this is really beautiful synergistic relationship with our gut microbiome, our skin microbiome, the environmental microbiome all around us. That is just so important. I think about growing food, right? Because again, like, where does our microbiome end and the environmental microbiome begin? It's a pretty fuzzy line. So growing food has a profound effect on our health, but particularly on mental health. If you can get your hands in the soil, there's a bacteria in soil called Bacterium vaccae, which actually increases serotonin, the production of serotonin. So it's like this natural antidepressant in the soil. So, if you can be in nature and get your hands dirty, that's going to help our microbiome, but it's also going to help our mental state.
Even walking, forest bathing, right?
Yeah.
Just research
Or-
on being in the trees,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
it's so profound.
In community, right? Too, like being around other people.
Yeah.
This is wild research that shows, in a household where one person was on antibiotics, it affected the microbiome of everyone else in the household. But there was only one person on antibiotics.
Wow.
It's incredible.
That
Think
is
about that. How is that possible?
yeah, we're not quite as individual as we think we are.
No, not at all.
Well,
We
I
need
mean, women in the same environment after not too long, they start menstruating at the same,
right,
yes,
right,
cycle. The moon affects that. Like, it's of course we're affected by these
of
things,
course.
right? Yeah, yeah. Well, we are coming to the end of our time, and I want to just invite you to speak into anything that you feel that has been left unsaid that you want to make sure people hear.
Yeah, I think, look, we know the rates of depression, anxiety, stress, has increased, in some cases 30% over the past few years for a variety of reasons, some of them obvious. As people start to feel like these feelings of fear and anxiety, instead of what we've been taught to do our whole lives is to shove it down and ignore it and shy away from it, is to look at it with curiosity.
Mm.
If we can look at the feelings of fear, anxiety with curiosity, depression, then maybe they become guideposts for us. I've found more often than not, when we have fear, particularly if it's sort of unexplained fear, we're not being chased or mugged or anything, that it's sort of pointing us in a direction. And to follow that with curiosity, the fear and anxiety tend to subside when you just look at it,
Mhm. Yep.
lean into it, breathe into it. But you may discover something, about yourself that you may not have discovered before, some sort of purpose. I think that's really powerful.
There's a I love this because there's a statement in Buddhist and non-dual tantric Shaivism that talks about the near enemy to truth. And
Mhm.
I call it the tyranny of positive thinking.
Mm.
And this one, that you're pointing to, that,
Mm.
there's in the new age manifestation world, there's a near enemy to truth that, yeah, your thoughts do create your reality. And the judge that sits and says, well, that thought's negative, you're not allowed to have it,
Mm.
is actually harming, not helping.
Yep.
Right. And so it's like you're disempowering yourself. You're basically, I think about it like if you're a parent and you've ever had a toddler and your toddler is trying to get your attention, they'll do it in a variety of ways until you're finally paying attention. And so, if you just look to your toddler and say, "Oh, I see you're trying to get my attention," with compassionate curiosity, you're going to have a different outcome than you are if you just say, "Shut up, be quiet," and have the attitude that this child should be seen and not heard.
Mhm.
Then there's going to be some sort of sideways way of getting your attention. And, that's the way anxiety is often that child that has been ignored for too long and
Mhm.
needs some curious compassion, just some listening, some, oh, I see you're trying to get my attention. What can I do for you? And you're absolutely right. Right there, it just calms down. It
Mhm.
dissipates. The knot goes away in the body just with that. It doesn't take very
It
long.
doesn't.
Right.
It doesn't take very
Yeah.
long.
Right, it
Yeah.
doesn't. In fact, I had, and that goes for pain too. I guess, if the more you suppress these emotions, these experiences, the anxieties, the more they suppress, the more they control you. And then the knock gets louder, just like the toddler gets louder and more aggressive, right? Until it becomes pain or inflammation or disease, So yeah, I think, being able to look at that. I had this incredible experience with Jane Hogan, who we interviewed for the masterclass. She took us through this guided meditation at the end, where it's like, find some place in your body where you feel pain. It was like, for me, it was like my lower back. I sit too much during the day, right? So my lower back was bothering me. And it's like this 5-minute guided meditation, which is bringing attention, this white light to where the pain was. And within that couple of minutes, the pain went from like a 6 to a 1.
Mm,
It's the opposite of what we're taught, the opposite of what we think. If you pay attention to it with compassion, it
mhm.
it starts to dissipate. But also it's like, what is that? For me, it was like, "Oh, well, you're sitting too much." I was like, "Well,
Yeah.
that's the answer, right?"
Yeah.
Right.
Just gotta move
Joe,
more.
thank you so much for being here. I mean, what a delightful conversation, and we learned so much from you. I really appreciate you having the courage and taking the time to
Yes.
to
Really an honor.
talk to us
Really
today.
really an honor. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, everyone. In the show notes, we're going to have a registration link for the project that Joe's been talking about and how to reach out to him. And we so appreciate your work. Till next time, be well, everybody.